Humanity's eagerly awaited space colonization dreams quickly devolved into a desperate fight for survival against a ruthless alien enemy hell-bent on eradicating mankind. Brian Murphy, hardened ex-Navy SEAL turned private contractor, warily eyed the encrypted message on his comlink. The United Nations Space Command urgently needed his unique skills for a covert operation to infiltrate the nefarious Barzans and gather intel on their impending assault on Earth. The year was 2075. Humanity had boldly expanded to Mars, Luna, and beyond, but extreme scarcity, fierce political strife between settlements, and the emergence of the Barzans, a powerful conquering alien race, now threatened fragile human space progress. Varys, cunning Barzan leader, craved Earth's rich reserves to feed his species' relentless expansion. The UNSC intercepted chilling attack plans. If the Barzans struck first, it would decimate humanity's homeworld, likely dooming mankind to extinction. Now everything hinged on Brian's critical stealth mission behind enemy lines. One man, one shot. The entire human race in the balance. This was the sole reason he'd endured brutal SEAL training, then years more sculpting mind and body into a precision weapon, to be the invisible scalpel surgically neutralizing mankind's enemies. It was also his shot at redemption. After his soulmate and their little girl died in a senseless shuttle accident, he nearly ate his plasma pistol in despair. UNSC psych reports damned him as an unstable alcoholic, one bender away from blowing his brains out. This mission was his last chance. He had to keep his shit together. He had to make their sacrifices mean something. Because if he failed, the Barzans would burn Earth to cinders, and his family's deaths would be rendered meaningless. Brian's stealth suit shimmered as it adapted to the alien ship's dark metallic walls. He crept through winding corridors, avoiding patrols with his enhanced sensors. Reaching a secure terminal, he hacked in and discovered schematics for a terrifying new Barzan weapon, a quantum singularity bomb that could annihilate entire planets. Varys planned to use it on Earth's major cities, sowing chaos for an easy invasion. As Brian downloaded the intel, a young Barzan named Zor-El entered the room. "You're no technician," Zor-El said warily, reaching for his sidearm. Brian held up his hands. "Wait. I'm here to stop this insane plan. Billions will die if that bomb is used." Zor-El hesitated. I have doubts. It feels wrong to slaughter civilians." "Help me disable the bomb and I'll grant you asylum on Earth. A new life." Zor-El made his choice. They accessed the mainframe, uploading a virus to corrupt the detonation sequence. Suddenly the door hissed open. It was Kral R, Varys's brutal second-in-command. "Traitors!" Kral roared, opening fire. Brian shoved Zor-El aside, his armor absorbing the plasma bolts. He launched forward, engaging Kral in vicious close combat. They traded crushing blows as Zor-El grappled with the guards. Though outnumbered, Brian's skills proved superior. He snapped Kralar's neck just as Zor-El crumpled from a shot to the abdomen. The virus finished uploading. The bomb was disabled. But Zor-El was fading fast. Brian scooped him up and sprinted for the escape pods, alarms blaring. He sealed them inside a pod and slammed the eject button, sending them hurtling into space. "Colonel Jameson, mission accomplished," Brian reported over comms, applying pressure to Zor-El's wound. "But I need immediate extraction and medical for an asset." "Damn it, Murphy, this complicates things," Jameson grumbled. "But we'll bring you in. You know this is just the start, right? Foiling one plot won't stop the Barzans." "Yeah," Brian said grimly, as Zor-El groaned in pain. "It's gonna be a long war." Laser blasts from the Barzan ship streaked past their pod, barely missing as the UNSC frigate came into view. The UNSC frigate docked at Earth's orbital station, and Brian carefully carried a still unconscious Zor-El to the medical bay. UNSC guards met them, escorting the pair to a secure debriefing room. Admiral Elena Novak, a stern woman with sharp eyes, awaited them. "Commander Murphy, I see you've brought a guest," Novak said, eyeing Zor-El. Brian nodded. "This is Zor-El. He helped me sabotage the Barzan weapon and escape. In exchange, I promised him asylum." Novak frowned but didn't argue. As Zor-El received treatment, He shared valuable intel on the Barzans. "They're not just another spacefaring race," Zor-El explained. "The Barzans were genetically engineered by an ancient species called the progenitors. It's why they're so advanced. Varys believes it's the Barzans' destiny to inherit the progenitors' technology and rule the galaxy." Brian leaned forward. "What about the quantum bomb? Are there more?" Zor-El hesitated. "I'm not sure, but I know Varys has a secret research base on Xandar Prime. That's likely where he's developing other weapons." Admiral Novak turned to Brian. "Commander, I need you to infiltrate that base, steal the weapon plans and destroy their research. We can't let the Barzans get any stronger." Brian stood ready for action. "I'll need a team, small and elite." He thought immediately of Jack Ramirez, his old SEAL buddy, and Dr. Lena Sorensen, a brilliant UNSC scientist he'd worked with before. As they geared up, Brian found Zor-El in the armory. The young Barzan looked lost. "I never believed in Varys's ideology," Zor-El confessed, "but I was afraid to resist. You showed me another way." Brian clasped his shoulder. "I know something about guilt, kid. I lost my family because I wasn't there to protect them." He met Zor-El's eyes. "But we have a chance to make sure no one else loses their loved ones to Varys's warmongering. So let's finish this." Using a captured Barzan ship, they slipped past Xandar Prime's defenses and landed in a remote canyon near the research base. But as they crept closer, Brian realized the place was a fortress. Watchtowers studded the perimeter, and patrols of heavily armed Barzan soldiers roamed the grounds. "Shit," Ramirez muttered. "No way we're fighting through that, even with our tech." Brian gritted his teeth. A frontal assault would be suicide. They'd have to find another way in. He surveyed the base through his scope, searching for any weakness they could exploit. There had to be a way. There was always a way. Zor-El tapped furiously at his wrist console as the team crouched in the shadows outside the research base. "Got it?" he whispered. "I've hacked their surveillance grid. We'll have a 90-second window to get inside undetected." Brian nodded, his face grim. "Let's move." He and Ripper took point, their plasma rifles sweeping the darkness as they dropped into the drainage tunnel. The dank passageway echoed with their footsteps and the distant drip of water. Dr. Sorensen and Zor-El followed close behind, the scientist's brow furrowed in concentration. Emerging into the facility's sterile corridors, they split up as planned. Brian and Zor-El slipped towards the central lab, while Ripper and Dr. Sorensen peeled off to plant their charges. The lab door hissed open. Brian's eyes widened. Banks of cylinders lined the walls, each containing a floating Barzan figure. Cables snaked from their bodies to humming machines. "By the void," Zor-El breathed. "Varys has done it. He's created his abominations." Brian strode to the main terminal, slamming in a data drive. "We need to get this intel back to—" A plasma bolt sizzled over his head. He spun, dropping into a combat crouch. Varys loomed in the doorway, flanked by a phalanx of augmented soldiers. The Barzan commander sneered. "Did you really think you could steal my life's work, human?" Brian and Zor-El dove for cover as a storm of plasma fire erupted. The lab disintegrated into chaos, beakers shattering and equipment sparking. Brian popped up, unleashing lethal bursts from his rifle. 2 super soldiers fell, holes smoking in their chests, but they rose again, flesh knitting before his eyes. "Regenerative abilities," Zor-El confirmed, blasting away. The Barzans advanced, shrugging off wounds that should have been fatal. Brian gritted his teeth. They couldn't hold out much longer. Where the hell were? The world shook as explosions ripped through the base. Varys staggered, his eyes widening in rage. "What have you done?" "Bought us a distraction," Brian growled. "Zor-El now!" The young Barzan lunged, snatching the data drive. They sprinted for the door, leaping over fallen soldiers. Alarms shrieked as they pounded down smoke-filled halls. Varys's bellow of fury echoed behind them. Brian risked a glance back. The Barzan commander was in pursuit, his face a mask of pure malice. And he wasn't alone. A pack of super soldiers loped behind him, moving with terrifying speed. Brian cursed, snapping off shots. They ducked and wove, shrugging off his hits. "Zor-El, take the drive." Brian shoved the data into the Barzan's hands. "Get to the ship, I'll hold them off." "I won't leave you," Zor-El protested. Brian wheeled, slamming a super soldier into the wall. "Go, that's an order." Zor-El hesitated a split second longer before racing away. Brian turned to face the oncoming horde, a cold smile on his lips. "All right, you bastards. Let's dance." He became a whirlwind of lethal precision, his rifle and vibroblades flashing. Augmented Barzans fell before him, but always more came. A plasma bolt seared his armor. A vibroblade cut deep into his side. He fought on, an unstoppable force of nature. But even he had limits. His breath came in ragged gasps. His blood ran slick beneath his suit, and still Varys and his soldiers kept coming. Brian fell back step by step, the creatures pressing their advantage. He just needed to buy a little more time, let the others get free. The drainage tunnel yawned before him. Beyond it, he heard the scream of the ship's engines. He lunged for the tunnel mouth, his fingers scraping permacrete. A vice grip seized his ankle, wrenching him back. Varys loomed over him, triumph blazing in his eyes. "You're too late, human. The ascendancy rises." Brian lashed out, his boot smashing into Varys's jaw. The Barzan reeled back, his grip loosening just for a moment, but a moment was all Brian needed. He rolled free, plunging into the tunnel's depths. Plasma bolts sizzled around him as he leapt from the tunnel's mouth, hitting the ground hard. The ship hovered above, ramp lowered. Ripper and Dr. Sorensen lay down covering fire as Zor-El pulled him aboard. Brian collapsed in the cargo hold, his breath coming in shuddering gasps. "Go," he roared. "Get us out of here." Ripper punched the throttle and the ship clawed for the sky. But a sudden impact sent them staggering. Warning klaxons blared. Varys rose from the smoke, his eyes alight with madness. He held a strange weapon, alien metal writhing in his grasp. "You cannot escape the ascendancy," Varys thundered. "The progenitor's power belongs to me." He leveled the weapon, eldritch energy swirling around its barrel. Brian struggled to rise, his wounds screaming. This was it, the end of the line. Varys's finger tightened on the trigger. Brian stared down the barrel of Varys's alien weapon, his mind racing. The Barzan commander's eyes glinted with malice as he revealed his final gambit. "I have quantum singularity bombs planted in every major city on Earth," Varys sneered. "If I don't return to my ship within the hour, they will detonate, reducing your world to ashes." Brian's blood ran cold. He glanced at his team, seeing the same horror reflected in their eyes. "You have a choice, human," Varys continued. "Surrender and allow me to take the research data, or watch as your precious Earth is destroyed." Brian's grip tightened on his rifle. He couldn't let Varys escape with the data, but he couldn't let Earth be annihilated either. His options were rapidly dwindling. Slowly he lowered his weapon, letting it clatter to the floor. He raised his hands in apparent surrender. "All right, Varys, you win." Varys's eyes narrowed in suspicion, but a triumphant smile spread across his face. "A wise choice, human. Now kick the weapon over to me." Brian complied, sending the rifle skidding across the deck. As Varys reached for it, Brian's hand darted to his belt. In a lightning-fast motion, he activated the disguised EMP grenade and hurled it at Varys's feet. The grenade detonated in a blinding flash. Varys staggered, the progenitor weapon sparking and smoking in his grasp. Seizing the moment, Zor-El lunged forward, tackling Varys to the ground. The two Barzans grappled furiously, exchanging brutal blows. Varys's enhanced strength gave him the advantage, but Zor-El fought with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. Brian scrambled for his rifle, snatching it up and whirling to aim at the struggling figures. He couldn't get a clean shot without risking Zor-El. Varys slammed Zor-El against the bulkhead, his hands closing around the younger Barzan's throat. Zor-El clawed at Varys' grip, his face turning purple. "You will never win," Zor-El choked out. Varys snarled, raising his fist for a killing blow. At that moment, Brian's rifle cracked and Varys's head snapped back, a smoking hole in his forehead. The Barzan commander crumpled, his body falling away from Zor-El. Brian rushed forward, helping his ally to his feet. "We need to go now," Brian barked. The team raced through the ship, alarms blaring in their wake. They burst into the hangar, sprinting up the ramp of their waiting craft. Ripper slammed the throttle forward, and they rocketed into the sky, leaving the cursed planet behind. As they hurtled through hyperspace, Dr. Sorensen pored over the stolen research data. Her eyes widened as she uncovered the locations of the quantum singularity bombs. Brian immediately contacted Admiral Novak, relaying the critical intel. Within minutes, UNSC strike teams were mobilizing, racing to disarm the deadly devices before they could unleash unimaginable destruction. Brian slumped in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. Zor-El sat nearby, nursing his injuries. The two shared a look of understanding, an unspoken bond forged in the crucible of battle. As Earth grew larger in the viewscreen, Brian knew that their fight was far from over. The Barzans would retaliate, seeking vengeance for their fallen leader. But for now, they had struck a critical blow, buying humanity precious time. Brian's thoughts turned to Zor-El, the Barzan who had risked everything to help them. He had come to trust the young alien, to rely on him as a comrade in arms. It was a strange feeling, finding an ally among the enemy, but in the face of annihilation, old prejudices seemed to fall away. The ship shuddered as it entered Earth's atmosphere, the blue and green globe filling the screen. Brian straightened in his seat, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the UNSC frigate docked at Earth's orbital station, a hero's welcome awaited Brian and his team. Cheering crowds thronged the arrivals hall, waving flags and hoisting signs emblazoned with their names. Admiral Novak herself greeted them, her usually stern face split by a rare smile. "Damned fine work out there, Captain Murphy," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "You struck a critical blow against the Barzans. This is a turning point." Brian nodded, exhaustion and elation warring within him. "Thank you, Admiral, but we couldn't have done it without Zor-El. He risked everything to help us." Novak turned to the young Barzan, her gaze appraising. "I must admit I had my doubts about you, but your actions speak louder than words. Earth owes you a debt of gratitude." Zor-El inclined his head. "I only did what was right. My people have lost their way. I hope to help them find a better path." As they strode through the station, briefing rooms and command centers buzzed with activity. Giant holographic displays showed troop movements and fleet positions across the solar system. Brian frowned as he took in the data, a sinking feeling growing in his gut. "The Barzans are launching a massive counterattack," Novak confirmed grimly. "Not just on Earth, but on Mars and Luna, too. They're throwing everything they have at us." Brian clenched his fists. They had hurt the Barzans, but they had also backed them into a corner. Now they were lashing out with all their might. "What are our orders, Admiral?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Captain Murphy, you're being given command of Zeta Squadron, a new rapid response unit," Novak replied. "Your mission is to lead lightning strikes against high-value Barzan targets, disrupt their supply lines, destroy their infrastructure, throw their offensive into disarray." She turned to Zor-El. "You'll be Captain Murphy's second-in-command. Your knowledge of Barzan tactics will be invaluable." Zor-El squared his shoulders. "I won't let you down, Admiral, I swear it." Within hours, Zeta Squadron was gearing up, poring over intelligence reports and strike plans. Their first target, a Barzan supply depot on the edge of the asteroid belt, a major resupply point for their ships. As they boarded their stealth frigate, Brian clasped Zor-El's shoulder. "I'm counting on you out there, we all are." Zor-El met his gaze steadily. "I will fight to my last breath to protect Earth, you have my word." The supply depot loomed before them, a sprawling complex of docking bays and storage modules. Barzan warships hovered nearby, watchful guardians, but they didn't spot the cloaked human vessel sliding past their perimeter. In the frigate's armory, Brian and Zor-El prepped their gear, checking power cells and donning tactical armor. The rest of Zeta Squadron buzzed with nervous energy, a mix of hardened veterans and raw recruits united by grim determination. Brian activated the ship's intercom. "Listen up, Zeta. This is our first strike and it's critical. We knock out this depot, we put a serious dent in the Barzan's ability to maintain their offensive, but it won't be easy. Expect heavy resistance." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Remember your training. Watch your sectors, cover your squadmates. Zor-El and I will take point. Questions?" Silence greeted him. He nodded. "All right, let's do this." The frigate shuddered as it docked with the depot's airlock, magnetic clamps locking into place. The hatch hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. Brian and Zor-El moved in, rifles raised, scanning for threats. Motion trackers showed Barzan life signs ahead, clustered in the depot's control room. Brian signaled his team forward, hugging the walls, ears straining for the clank of sentry drones. They reached the control room door. Brian placed a breaching charge, sinking the detonator to his HUD. He held up a fist. 3 fingers, 2, 1. The door blew inward in a flash of shrapnel and smoke. Zeta Squadron stormed in, weapons blazing, catching the Barzan guards flat-footed. Purple blood spattered consoles as the aliens fell, screeching. Brian raced to the main terminal, slamming in a data drive. "Zor-El, cover me. Ripper demo, plant the charges." His fingers flew over the keyboard, eyes flicking over schematics and manifests. The depot was a treasure trove of munitions, fuel, spare parts, enough to keep the Barzan war machine rolling for months. "Not anymore." "Charges set," Ripper reported over the comm, 2 minutes to detonation. "Copy that," Brian replied. "Zeta, fall back to the exfil point, move." They sprinted back through the corridors, boots pounding, hearts racing. The first explosions ripped through the depot as they leapt into the airlock. The frigate detached, engines flaring, hurtling them clear of the expanding fireball. Brian sagged into his seat, adrenaline ebbing. He looked over at Zor-El, who stared out the viewport at the debris field that had once been a vital Barzan installation. "You good?" Brian asked. "Yeah," Zor-El replied quietly. "Just a lot to process. My own people." Brian clasped his arm. "You're doing the right thing. Don't ever doubt that." Zor-El met his eyes, nodding slowly. "I know, it's just hard." "War always is," Brian said heavily, "but we'll get through it, together." As the frigate angled towards the gleaming blue marble of Earth, Brian couldn't shake a prickling sense of unease. The supply depot had been too lightly defended, almost like... "Captain," the sensor officer called out, "I'm picking up life signs in the depot wreckage. Humans, sir." Brian shot to his feet. "What, survivors?" He leaned over the console, frowning at the biomonitor readings. They were faint, thready, but definitely human. What the hell were his people doing in a Barzan depot? "Get a rescue shuttle prepped now," he ordered, "and inform the Admiral something's not right here." The rescue team found a dozen humans floating in survival pods among the debris, battered and unconscious, but alive. As medics rushed them to sickbay, Brian stared down at one pod in particular, his gut clenching. Inside, hooked up to oxygen lines and IV drips, lay a ghost. A man Brian had last seen on a rain-swept battlefield on Arcturus IV, buying time for his unit to fall back. Colonel Jake Jameson, Brian's old CO, listed as KIA months ago. But here he was, prisoner of the Barzans, but why? Jameson's pod hissed open. The colonel blinked blearily, his gaunt face contorting in confusion and disbelief. "Murphy, that you?" he croaked. Brian gripped his hand. "Yeah, Colonel, it's me. You're safe now." Jameson struggled to sit up, wincing. "The others, we have to save them." "What others?" Brian pressed gently. "What happened to you, sir?" Jameson shuddered. "The Barzans, they've been running experiments on us, trying to figure out how to upgrade their soldiers." Brian's blood ran cold. Zor-El, standing beside him, hissed in shock. "They want to unlock human genetics," Jameson continued weakly. "Splice it with their own, make their warriors unstoppable." He clutched Brian's arm with sudden urgency. You have to stop them, Murphy. I heard them talking. They've got labs hidden across the galaxy, and the things they're doing... My God. Brian and Zor-El exchanged a grim look. This changed everything. Don't worry, Colonel, Brian said firmly. We'll find those labs. We'll burn them to the ground. He turned to Zor-El as Jameson slipped back into sedated sleep. Inform the Admiral. Tell her Zeta Squadron is going hunting. Over the next weeks, Brian and his team struck like lightning, appearing out of nowhere to hit Barzan outposts and research stations, then vanishing before the enemy could muster a response. Bit by bit, they pieced together intel on the locations of the hidden labs. But the Barzans adapted quickly, tightening security, laying traps and ambushes. Zeta Squadron took casualties, good soldiers lost in sudden fusillades of plasma fire or vicious close-quarters melees. Through it all, Brian and Zor-El grew closer, an unshakable bond forged in the crucible of war. They fought back to back, anticipating each other's moves, a human and a Barzan united against a common foe. But as they closed in on the final lab, buried deep in the storm-racked jungles of Talanac 7, they knew they were walking into their greatest challenge yet. The place will be a fortress, Zor-El warned as they pored over holomaps. Varys knows we're coming. He'll have his best troops guarding it. Brian chewed his lip thoughtfully. Then we'll need an edge, something he won't expect. He tapped a series of glyphs, zooming in on a seething patch of jungle a few clicks from the lab site. Biomonitor readings flickered over the foliage, painting a startling picture. Barzans, Brian said, but not loyal to Varys, rebels, dissidents. Zor-El leaned in, mandibles twitching. I've heard rumors of a growing resistance to the Emperor's rule, but to find them here... Brian nodded slowly. They could be just the wild card we need if we can convince them to join us. Zor-El hesitated. It's a gamble. They may not trust me, seeing me as a traitor, and they certainly won't trust you. I know, Brian said, but it's a chance we have to take. We can't do this alone, Zor-El. We need allies. The Barzan met his eyes, then sighed. You're right, as usual. I suppose I'll have to get used to that. Brian clasped his shoulder. Hey, I'm not always right, just most of the time. Zor-El snorted. Don't push it, human. As they gathered their gear and prepared to head into the jungle to parley with rebels and plan a desperate assault, Brian felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope? Against all odds, they had a chance to end Varys's mad schemes, to cripple the Barzan war effort, maybe even to sow the seeds of peace. It wouldn't be easy. It might well be the death of them. But Brian knew with sudden icy clarity that there was no other choice. They had to try, for Earth, for the human colonies, for a future free of the shadow of war. For a galaxy where humans and Barzans could perhaps one day live as equals. Brian hefted his rifle, feeling its weight, its purpose. Beside him, Zor-El did the same, yellow eyes gleaming with the same light. Ready? Brian asked quietly. Zor-El flashed him a fierce Barzan grin. Ready! Together they strode into the jungle, into the unknown, to forge an alliance that might just change the fate of the galaxy. As the team made their way back to the stolen Barzan ship, Dr. Sorensen's breath came in ragged gasps, her skin taking on a sickly pallor. Brian supported her weight, half dragging, half carrying her through the winding corridors. Stay with me, Doc, he urged, his jaw tight. We're almost there. Zor-El took point, his plasma rifle sweeping for threats. The ship loomed ahead, a promise of escape, but as they approached the airlock, a guttural roar echoed behind them. Brian risked a glance back. A horde of Barzan soldiers surged towards them, led by a massive, scarred warrior. The Barzan commander snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. Zor-El, Brian yelled. Get her to the ship. I'll hold them off. He turned to face the oncoming Barzans, dropping to one knee and opening fire. Plasma bolts stitched across the corridor, felling the first wave, but more kept coming, heedless of their fallen comrades. Brian's rifle clicked empty. He reached for another power cell, but a searing pain lanced through his shoulder. A plasma bolt had found its mark. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. In the ship, Zor-El lowered Dr. Sorensen onto a bunk in the cramped medbay. She shivered violently, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "The sample," she rasped. "You must get it to the UNSC, develop a cure." Zor-El clasped her hand. "I will, I promise." A cough racked her body, flecks of blood speckling her lips. "Go, leave me, get the sample to safety." Zor-El hesitated. Protocol dictated that he should prevent the virus from spreading at all costs. If Dr. Sorensen transformed, she could infect the entire ship, dooming their mission. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw not a liability, but a friend, an ally who had risked everything to help his people and hers. "No," he said firmly, "I'm not leaving you behind." He keyed the ship's intercom. "Brian, we have to go now." In the corridor, Brian fired his last shot, dropping the Barzan commander. But more soldiers pressed forward, trampling their leader's body. Brian stumbled back, his vision blurring. Zor-El's voice crackled over his comm. "Brian, Dr. Sorensen, she's not going to make it, the virus." Brian closed his eyes. He knew what had to be done. The mission came first. Earth depended on them getting that sample back. But as he reached for his plasma pistol, ready to do what was necessary, a memory flashed through his mind. His family, smiling and laughing before the war had taken them. The emptiness that had haunted him since. The feeling that he had nothing left to lose. Until now. He looked at the pistol in his hand. Then, with a growl of defiance, he hurled it at the advancing Barzans and sprinted for the airlock. He slammed his fist on the controls, sealing the door behind him. "Punch it, Zor-El," he roared, strapping himself into the co-pilot's chair. The ship lurched as Zor-El fired the engines, catapulting them away from the facility. Plasma fire pounded their shields, alarms blaring, but they held, and then they were clear, the blackness of space enveloping them. Brian sagged back in his seat, his wounded shoulder throbbing. In the medbay, Dr. Sorensen drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow. Zor-El glanced at Brian, his eyes questioning. "Why did you—" "Leave no one behind," Brian said quietly. "That's what we humans do." He met Zor-El's gaze. "Get us to Earth, fast. We'll find a way to save her." As the ship hurtled through the void, Brian knew that their mission was far from over. The Barzans would not stop until they had reclaimed the virus sample, and Dr. Sorensen's life hung by a thread, her fate intertwined with the fate of humanity itself. But they had bought a chance, a slim hope, and sometimes that was all you needed to keep fighting. Brian closed his eyes, the weight of command settling on his shoulders. The war raged on, and he knew that more hard choices lay ahead. But for now they flew on, Earth's last defenders, carrying the future in their hands. Brian's knuckles whitened on the ship's controls as he pushed the engines to their limit. In the medbay, Dr. Sorensen drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow and labored. Zor-El monitored her vital signs, his face etched with concern. "She's not going to make it to Earth," he said grimly. "The virus is spreading too fast." Brian gritted his teeth. "Then we find another way." He pulled up a star map, scanning for nearby friendly outposts. His eyes landed on a small moon, marked with the symbol of the Barzan resistance. "There," he said, pointing. "Kazral's base. If anyone has a cure, it'll be him." Zor-El hesitated. "Kazral is a legend among my people, a great general until he turned against the Emperor. But can we trust him?" "We don't have a choice," Brian said. He angled the ship towards the moon, skimming low over its cratered surface to avoid detection. They set down in a hidden canyon, the ship's camouflage shimmering as it blended with the rocky terrain. Brian lifted Dr. Sorensen gently, carrying her down the ramp. Zor-El followed, his rifle at the ready. A group of hooded figures emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. Brian tensed, ready for a fight, but then the lead figure threw back his hood, revealing a weathered Barzan face. "I am Kazral," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I've been expecting you." Brian blinked in surprise. How did you... Khazral smiled cryptically. We have our ways. Come, there's no time to waste. He led them into the base, a sprawling network of caves and tunnels. Barzan rebels moved about with purposeful efficiency, many bearing scars from their battles against the Emperor's forces. In the medical bay, Khazral introduced them to a slim, intense Barzan with a lab coat. This is Dr. Zelkan. He's been working on a cure for the virus. Dr. Zelkan nodded, his eyes fixed on Dr. Sorensen's pallid face. I believe I'm close, but the cure is untested. It could kill her as easily as save her. Brian looked at Zor-El, seeing his own desperation mirrored in the Barzan's eyes. We have to try, he said. Dr. Sorensen stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Do it, she whispered. I'm dead anyway. At least this way my death might mean something. Brian clasped her hand, feeling the heat of the fever raging through her. You're not going to die, he said fiercely. We're going to beat this thing. As Dr. Zelkan prepared the cure, alarms suddenly blared through the base. Khazral cursed, pulling up a screen. Barzan ships incoming! They've found us! Brian and Zor-El shared a look of grim determination. We'll hold them off, Brian said. Give you time to finish the cure. They raced through the tunnels, rallying the rebel defenders. As the first Barzan troops poured into the base, they met them with a hail of blaster fire. Brian ducked and wove, his rifle spitting plasma. Beside him, Zor-El fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, cutting down his former comrades without hesitation. But the Barzans kept coming, wave after wave. Brian's heart sank as he saw a familiar figure at their head, a figure he had once called friend and mentor. Colonel Jameson strode forward, his eyes blank and soulless. The Barzans had twisted him, broken him, turned him into a weapon against his own kind. Colonel, Brian shouted, stand down, you don't have to do this. But Jameson showed no sign of recognition. He raised his blaster, aiming at Brian's heart. Time seemed to slow. Brian saw Jameson's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Zor-El too far away to intervene. In that split second, he made his choice. His rifle kicked once, twice. Jameson staggered, holes smoking in his chest. He fell, his empty eyes staring at nothing. Brian stood over his body, numb with shock and grief. Then Zor-El was there, pulling him away, shouting in his ear. Brian, we have to go now. He shook himself, forcing down the pain. The mission. That was all that mattered. They fell back, step by step, the rebels' lines crumbling around them. The Barzans pressed forward, sensing victory. And then a shout from the rear. Dr. Zelkan, his face alight with triumph, a glowing vial in his hand. The cure, it's ready! They broke into a run, fighting for every step. In the medbay, Dr. Sorensen lay still and pale, her breath barely misting the oxygen mask. Dr. Zelkan injected the shimmering liquid into her arm, his hands shaking. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Dr. Sorensen gasped, her eyes flying open. Color flooded back into her cheeks. She sat up, wonder and disbelief on her face. It worked, she breathed. I can feel it, the virus, it's gone. Cheers erupted from the rebels, quickly silenced as another explosion rocked the base. Khazral's face was grim. You have to go, he said. Get the cure to your people. We'll hold the line here. Brian clasped his arm. Thank you, he said, for everything. They ran for the ship, dodging blaster bolts and falling debris. The ramp lowered, beckoning them to safety. But as they lifted off, a transmission crackled through the comms. It was Admiral Novak, her voice tight with strain. Captain Murphy, do you read me? The Barzans, they've launched an all-out assault on Earth. Our defenses are crumbling. We need that cure now. Brian's grip tightened on the controls. Beside him, Zor-El's face was set with determination. They broke atmosphere, the blackness of space enveloping them. Before them, the distant gleam of Earth under siege and fighting for its life. Brian pushed the throttle to full. They had the cure, they had hope. Now all they had to do was get it there in time. Earth loomed in the viewscreen, a once vibrant blue and green orb now marred by sickly grey splotches. Brian's heart sank as their ship descended through the atmosphere, revealing the scope of the devastation below. New York City, the crown jewel of human civilization, lay in ruins. Skyscrapers crumbled, bridges collapsed, fires raged unchecked. And everywhere, the infected roamed, their bodies twisted by the Barzan virus into something barely human. The ship touched down in a war-torn Central Park. The once lush greenery now a muddy wasteland, pockmarked with craters. A squad of haggard UNSC soldiers emerged from the tree line, weapons drawn. "Identify yourselves," barked the lead soldier, a stocky woman with sergeant's stripes on her armor. Brian held up his hands, Zor-El mirroring the gesture beside him. "Captain Brian Murphy, UNSC. We have the cure for the virus." The sergeant's eyes widened. She lowered her rifle and stepped forward, her face a mix of hope and desperation. "Sergeant Rachel Davis, sir. Thank God you made it. We're barely holding the line here." Brian nodded grimly. "What's the situation, Sergeant?" "The Barzans have taken the Grand Central Transport Hub," Davis reported. "They're using it as a staging ground for their troops and to block our distribution of the cure. We can't get supplies or reinforcements in or out." Brian exchanged a glance with Zor-El. "Then that's our target. We take back the hub, we can turn the tide." Davis shook her head. "Sir, with respect, my squad has been fighting for days. We're running on fumes. And the Barzans, they've got those infected creatures as shock troops now. It's a slaughter out there." Brian clasped her shoulder. "I know you're exhausted, Sergeant, but this is our chance to end this. The cure is useless if we can't get it to the people. We need every able body for this fight." Davis met his gaze, her jaw tight. Then she nodded. "Understood, sir. We're with you." They geared up quickly, distributing ammo and medical supplies. Dr. Sorensen loaded vials of the cure into a portable injector, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. As they moved out, the true horror of the infected city revealed itself. Streets choked with abandoned cars, storefronts shattered, bodies strewn like discarded dolls, and the infected shambling masses of twisted flesh attacking anything that moved with mindless ferocity. Brian led the charge, his plasma rifle spitting blue fire. Zor-El was a blur of motion at his side, his Barzan-forged blades slicing through infected and Barzan soldiers alike. Davis and her squad fought with the desperate strength of those with nothing left to lose. Block by block, building by building, they clawed their way towards Grand Central. The Barzans had fortified the iconic terminal, energy shields shimmering over barricaded entrances. Plasma fire rained down from hastily erected towers, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. Brian ducked behind the rusted husk of a city bus, Davis crouching beside him. "We'll never break through head-on," she panted, blood seeping from a gash on her forehead. Brian nodded, his mind racing. His eyes fell on a manhole cover a few yards away. "The subway tunnels, they connect to the terminal basement. If we can get a team inside—" Davis grinned fiercely. "Outflank the bastards, I like it!" They gathered the remnants of their force. Brian, Zor-El, Davis, and a handful of her best soldiers would infiltrate via the tunnels. The rest would stage a frontal assault, a diversion to draw the Barzan's attention. The tunnels were dark and dank, echoing with the distant skittering of infected. They moved cautiously, headlamps casting eerie shadows on tile walls. As Zor-El held up a fist, his senses heightened by Barzan biology. "Movement ahead," he whispered. "A patrol 6 strong." Brian signaled the team to halt. He and Zor-El crept forward, hugging the walls. In a flash of motion they struck, silent and lethal. The Barzans fell without a sound, energy blades fading as they clattered to the ground. They reached the terminal basement unopposed, the muffled sounds of battle raging above. Brian placed a breaching charge on the heavy metal door, nodding to Davis. The door blew inward in a flash of shrapnel and smoke. They stormed into the terminal, catching the Barzan defenders off guard. Plasma fire crisscrossed the grand concourse, searing stone and incinerating flesh. Brian and Zor-El fought their way to the central control room, a nerve center of computers and communications gear. Barzan technicians scrambled for weapons, but they were no match for the battle-hardened warriors. Within minutes the hub was secure. Brian activated his comm. "This is Captain Murphy. Grand Central is ours. Begin cure distribution immediately." Cheers erupted over the link. Weary voices filled with newfound hope. UNSC medics flooded into the terminal, setting up triage centers and distribution points. But their elation was short-lived. A panicked voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, we've got a problem. The Barzans, they've unleashed some kind of monster near Times Square. It's tearing through our lines. We can't stop it." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He looked to Zor-El, seeing his own dread mirrored in the Barzan's eyes. "Sergeant Davis, hold this position," Brian ordered. "Keep distributing the cure. Zor-El and I will deal with this new threat." Davis nodded, her face grim. "Give 'em hell, sir." As they raced through the war-torn streets, the sounds of screams and rending metal grew louder. They rounded a corner and froze in horror. A massive creature rampaged through the ruins of Times Square, a nightmarish fusion of flesh and metal. It stood 3 stories tall, a hulking abomination of bulging muscles and gleaming cybernetics. Energy weapons protruded from its misshapen limbs, spitting searing death. UNSC soldiers fired desperately at the beast, but their weapons seemed to have no effect. The creature shrugged off plasma bolts and rockets, its wounds sealing almost as quickly as they were inflicted. "By the gods," Zor-El breathed, "what have my people created?" Brian gritted his teeth. "Doesn't matter, we have to take it down or there won't be a city left to save." They charged into the fray, weapons blazing. The creature swiveled its massive head towards them, its maw opening in a roar that shook the ground. Brian rolled to avoid a blast of energy, the pavement exploding where he'd stood a heartbeat before. Zor-El leapt onto the creature's back, his blades seeking gaps in its armored hide. But for every wound they inflicted, the creature seemed to grow stronger, faster. It lashed out with terrifying speed, sending soldiers flying like broken dolls. "We need a new plan," Brian shouted over the chaos. "We can't beat this thing head-on." Dr. Sorensen's voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, I've been analyzing the creature's biology. I think I found a weakness. Its regenerative abilities are centered in a cluster of organs in its chest cavity. If you can get a clear shot—" Brian nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Zor-El, I need you to draw its attention. Keep it focused on you." The Barzan grinned fiercely. "With pleasure." Zor-El leapt from the creature's back, rolling to its front. He slashed at its legs, ducking and weaving as it lashed out with crushing blows. Brian sprinted for the wreckage of a nearby building, clambering up twisted girders and shattered concrete. He reached the roof, the creature looming below like a titan of ancient myth. He unslung his plasma rifle, setting it to maximum power. The weapon whined as it charged, heat sinks glowing cherry red. "Zor-El now," Brian roared. The Barzan feinted left, then dove right, sliding between the creature's legs. It roared in frustration, rearing up to expose its chest, a pulsing mass of cybernetic implants and puckered flesh. Brian fired, a lance of blinding blue plasma erupting from his rifle. The bolt struck the creature dead center, burning through armor and bone and organ. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the creature staggered, ichor pouring from the gaping wound in its chest. It let out a final defiant roar and toppled, crushing cars and rubble beneath its bulk. Brian sagged against the rooftop railing, his rifle clattering from nerveless fingers. Zor-El picked his way through the wreckage, his armor scorched and dented, but his eyes alight with triumph. "We did it," the Barzan said, his voice tinged with awe. "We actually did it." Brian nodded wearily. "Yeah, but at what cost?" His gaze drifted over the shattered city, the countless lives lost. So much destruction, so much pain. And for what? A few miles of reclaimed territory, a temporary respite from the Barzan onslaught? His comm crackled, dragging him from his dark thoughts. "Captain Murphy, this is Admiral Novak. The Barzans are in full retreat. Their forces are disintegrating, their command structure in chaos. It's over, son. We won." Brian closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. Understood, Admiral. Murphy out. He looked to Zor-El, seeing his own weariness reflected in the Barzan's face. What now? Brian asked quietly. After all this? Where do we go from here? Zor-El placed a hand on Brian's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and camaraderie. We rebuild, he said simply. We honor the fallen, and we make sure their sacrifices were not in vain. Brian nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess that's all we can do. They picked their way down from the rooftop, joining the UNSC forces sifting through the rubble. Medics tended to the wounded, while engineers began the long process of clearing debris and restoring power. But even as they worked, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Barzans had been defeated, but at a terrible price. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, forced to confront the depths of its own savagery in the face of annihilation. And what of the Barzans themselves, Zor-El's people, twisted and manipulated by their leaders into instruments of conquest and genocide? Could there ever be peace between their species after so much blood had been spilled? These were questions without easy answers. But as Brian looked out over the ruins of New York, he knew one thing with certainty. He was a soldier, a warrior to his core, and as long as there were threats to humanity, as long as there were innocents to protect and evils to fight, he would be there standing on the front lines, ready to give everything for the cause. It was his duty, his purpose. And in a galaxy torn by war and chaos, it was the only thing that made sense anymore. He turned to Zor-El, a weary smile on his lips. Come on, we've got work to do. In the weeks following the defeat of the Barzan invasion, the shattered cities of Earth slowly began to rebuild. The rubble was cleared away, the dead were mourned, and the survivors picked up the pieces of their lives. But even as humanity celebrated its hard-won victory, those in power knew that the threat was far from over. The Barzans had been defeated, but at a terrible cost. The UNSC had been pushed to its limits, its forces stretched thin across the solar system. In response, the United Nations Security Council authorized the creation of a new division, the Interstellar Defense Force. The IDF would be a rapid response unit, tasked with protecting human interests not just on Earth, but across the galaxy. And there was only one man that Admiral Novak trusted to lead it. Brian sat in his cramped office in the temporary UNSC headquarters, staring at the holographic display of his promotion orders. Major Brian Murphy, commanding officer of IDF Alpha Team. Part of him wanted to refuse to walk away from the military life that had cost him so much, but he knew that he couldn't. Not now, not with the threats that lurked in the darkness of space. The door hissed open, and Zor-El stepped inside. The Barzan had become a trusted ally, and now he would be Brian's second-in-command. "Are you ready for this?" Zor-El asked, his yellow eyes studying Brian's face. Brian stood, straightening his uniform. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said. "We've got work to do." Their first mission came sooner than expected. A distress signal from a human colony on the edge of known space, reporting an attack by unknown hostiles. As the IDF dropship hurtled through the void, Brian briefed his team. "We don't know what we're walking into," he said, "but we do know that there are civilians down there, and they're counting on us." The colony was a smoldering ruin when they arrived, the buildings blasted to rubble, the streets littered with bodies, but there was no sign of the attackers. Brian and Zor-El led the way, their weapons drawn, scanning for any sign of movement. And then they saw it, a flicker of motion in the shadows. Brian raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Slowly he approached the figure, his rifle at the ready. It was a human, a colonist, his clothes ragged and his face streaked with blood and dirt. "You have to help us," he whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. "They came out of nowhere, like ghosts. They took the others, dragged them away." Brian knelt beside the man. "Who took them?" he asked. "Who attacked you?" The man shook his head. "I don't know, but they were looking for something. They kept asking about the Nexus." Brian and Zor-El exchanged a glance. The Nexus. They had heard whispers of it before, an ancient alien artifact of immense power, but until now it had been nothing more than a legend. As they searched the ruins of the colony, they found more signs of the attackers. Strange alien weapons, unlike anything they had seen before, and a symbol carved into the walls of the buildings. A symbol that Zor-El recognized. "The Barzans," he said, his voice grim. "This is their work." But as they delved deeper, they realized that the truth was far more complex. The Barzans had been searching for the Nexus, but they were not alone. Other factions, both human and alien, were also on the trail of the artifact, each with their own agenda. And so began a desperate race across the stars, as Brian and his team fought to uncover the secrets of the Nexus before it fell into the wrong hands. They battled mercenaries and pirates, forged alliances with alien races, and delved into ancient ruins on long-forgotten worlds. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but also deeper into danger. On a desolate moon, they finally confronted the mastermind behind the conspiracy, a rogue UNSC admiral named Blackwell. The admiral had allied himself with the remnants of the Barzan forces, promising them the power of the Nexus in exchange for their loyalty. In a brutal firefight, Brian and his team fought their way into Blackwell's stronghold. They found the admiral in a vaulted chamber, the Nexus pulsing with eldritch energy before him. "You're too late, Murphy," Blackwell sneered. "With this power I will reshape the galaxy in my image, and you will be nothing but dust beneath my feet." Brian and Zor-El charged forward, their weapons blazing. The Admiral's guards fell before them, but Blackwell himself was a formidable opponent, enhanced by the Nexus's dark energy. In a final desperate gambit, Zor-El leapt forward, grappling with the Admiral. The two tumbled to the ground, struggling for control of the Nexus. And then Blackwell's blade found its mark, piercing Zor-El's chest. The Barzan let out a gasp, his blood spilling onto the ancient stone. With a roar of fury, Brian surged forward, slamming into Blackwell with all his strength. The two men fought, trading blows with savage intensity. In the end, it was Brian who emerged victorious, standing over Blackwell's broken body. But as he turned to Zor-El, he saw that his friend was fading fast. "The Nexus," Zor-El whispered, his voice ragged with pain. "It's not just a weapon, it's a key to unlocking the secrets of the universe itself." And with those final words, Zor-El breathed his last. Brian and his team returned to Earth, the Nexus secured. They were hailed as heroes, their names etched into history. But for Brian, the victory was hollow. As he stood before the memorial to the fallen, he felt the weight of all he had lost. Zor-El, Sergeant Davis, and so many others, all sacrificed in the name of duty. He knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that humanity was taking its first steps into a larger, more dangerous universe, and he knew that it would fall to him and those like him to protect the innocent from the threats that lurked in the darkness. Brian turned to face his team, his eyes hard with determination. "We have a job to do," he said, "and we will not fail." You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.